The Voice of Russia World Service presents another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. This song is being performed by members of the Pesnoslov Male Choir. Pesnoslov's founder and choirmaster Gleb Pechonkin thus explains the meaning of his band's name.
Pesnoslov – это, собственно, древнее слово, перевод с греческого языка, гимнологос.
It's an ancient word, which translates from Greek as an anthem, and also stands for someone who writes and sings liturgical chants.
The Pesnoslov choir stands out even from among other, equally imaginative and pioneering performers of old Russian church music. Before we go, let's take a brief look into the past. In ancient Russia, monasteries and big churches were the main centers of this country's cultural, scientific, and educational advancement. The monks chronicled the past and present events, painted icons that are still venerated as holy relics and at the same time as masterpieces of old Russian art. They also wrote liturgical chants, many of which have lived to these days. All these things are now being revived by the Russian churches and monasteries, some which boast their own choirs and talented soloists. The Pesnoslov Choir is one of them. The choir came about in Fryazino, a small town outside Moscow, in a church built to honor the Smolensk icon of the Holy Mother of God. The icon, otherwise called Odigitria, which is the Greek for a guide, is believed to have been painted by Luke the Apostle, the author of the first ever portraits of the Virgin. This icon, much venerated in Russia, is famous for the numerous miracles it has worked over the centuries. In the 12th century, they brought it to Russia from the Byzantine Empire and displayed it in a church in the western Russian city of Smolensk, and countless copies were later made all throughout Russia. the icon must have been patronizing the city in a very special way since they built a church in its name there. Who knows, maybe the very fact that a team of so special musicians have got together is also a sign of this divine patronage? The choir's presenter and founder, Gleb Pichonkin, is a professional conductor and composer who studied at the Academy of Choral Art and the Moscow Conservatory. It was then, in the mid-1990s, that he talked 5 of his fellow singers and choir master friends to come together to perform old Russian church music. That was how the Pesnoslov Choir actually came about. Before very long, they were already singing in concerts in their spare time, and 2 years later, they released their first compact disc. In today's program, we'll listen to some of the tunes from this absolutely one-of-a-kind record. It was a 17th century liturgical chant which the musicians deciphered from an ancient manuscript. Each song they sing is the result of some really arduous work because old chants are extremely hard to find these days. This deficit stems from our atheistic Soviet past, when religious music was virtually non-existent. Trying to bring back this musical heritage, members of the Pesnoslov Choir are working in the archives, sifting through old, handwritten sheet music and trying to emulate the singing technique of old. Centuries ago, people used symbols that had absolutely nothing to do with the notational symbols we know these days. The singing technique also differed significantly. Unfazed by the sheer scope of work to be done, the musicians, also young and bristling with enthusiasm, are working hard, bringing back the half-forgotten traditions of old Russian church music. Gleb Pichonkin says,
Пение на Руси было единое до XVII века.
Before the 17th century, he says, Russian singing was a unified system that based on chants once brought in by our fellow Orthodox Byzantine Greeks. The Russian singers eventually put their stamp on these chants, bringing together the Byzantine system and the Russian mentality.
Let's now listen to a Byzantine melody sung by members of the Pesnoslov Choir.
Это пение не стояло на месте, оно тоже развивалось, и своего апогея
In the 17th century,
оно достигло в
Lev
17 веке.
Pichonkin continues, the highly elaborate Russian technique of church singing that was without parallel in the Orthodox world reached its pinnacle, and that was probably one of the reasons why it eventually collapsed. Experts believe that there were other reasons too, such as the gradual westernization of the Russian public life in the 17th century. They started breaking down the old traditional melodies into several voices, an innovation that was riding roughshod of the old Byzantine tradition. The traditional musical style was on its way out, making way for a new one, which, Gleb Pichonkin says, was a very sad thing that happened to the Russian music back in the 17th century.
Gleb's nostalgia for the good old times is understandable, but the Russian church music has come a long and rather interesting way since the 17th century turnaround. No way, Gleb says, what we've got is a gaping precipice.
Вот то, к чему мы пришли в 20 веке. Можно назвать это церковно-певческая полистилистика.
All that we have seen happening in the 20th century, he argues, I call a polystylistics of church singing, a term we can find in classical music. The old Russian church music gave preference to the words, because in the Orthodox service, the words always come first. Not so in the Catholic Church, where they play the organ during their services. If we recite an Orthodox service from beginning to end, it will not lose its meaning. That's why the whole system of song-like recitals was essentially monophonic. This is where the old system of church singing differs from the one we have now.
Pechonkin wrote the music to this canonical text himself. A choir master and composer, he has also organized a number of international tours for his choir, including a recent visit to the United States.
Мы проехали часть восточного побережья от Новой Англии до Флориды. Далее
we toured the East Coast, from New England all the way down to Florida, Gleb recounts. We played 20 concerts, and wherever we went, we were handing out our cassette discs. We have since changed our priorities somehow. We are keeping a lower profile now, trying to concentrate on the main thing, which is the revival of old Russian spiritual traditions.
We'll tell you more about the Pesnoslov Church Choir next week. And before we say goodbye, here they are again singing an old Russian religious chant. And there we end this edition of the Christian Message from Moscow that was prepared by Vladimir Dyomin, written by Nadezhda Pronina, and presented by Ivan Sedov and me, Boris Novikov. Tune in at the same time next week. Goodbye, and God bless you all. The Voice of Russia World Service presents another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. Today we continue our introduction of the Pesnoslov Male Choir, whose members sing old Russian church music and who appeared in our last week's program. There are only 5 people singing in Pesnoslov, a large enough outfit by church standards to make a choir. The band initially formed as a church choir at the church in Fryazino, a small town not far away from Moscow. Its members are all professional singers and choir masters, and they have spent some time singing in concerts, something you cannot see church choirs doing every day. The singers are so good that they stand out from among even their most gifted colleagues. Pesnoslov is an old Russian word which translates from Greek as an anthem and also stands for someone who writes and sings liturgical songs. The choir's founding leader, Gleb Pechonkin, fits this description just fine. He's a composer, conductor, and singer who also figures out and arranges old Russian religious chants. In our previous program, Gleb was speaking about the unique system of Russian church singing that existed in this country up until the 17th century. He continues.
В печальном XVII веке, когда русская жизнь, русский уклад жизни, традиции начинают искусственно рушиться, Россия искусственно переделывает.
The young man says that in the fateful 17th century, the traditional Russian lifestyle was artificially destroyed, and the country itself turned into a Western-type state. The musical culture changed accordingly, with the old tunes being broken down into several voicings, an innovation that was starkly at odds with this country's traditional system of church singing. Then came the Italians, who started instilling their own musical style. Italian composers and singers worked in Russia in the 18th and early 20th centuries, Gleb Pechonkin says, and they changed the very style of our secular and religious music. age-old chants are like the last flickers of a civilization long gone, and which Gleb Pechonkin and his bandmates are trying so hard to bring back in their music. The old system of Russian Orthodox church singing is like a vast continent long lost in the time ocean, an Atlantis waiting to be rediscovered. For fairness' sake, we should say that the singing system of old has never entirely been lost. It was entrenched deep in the hearts and minds of many Russian religious and mainstream musicians who yearned for this almost forgotten element of church music and tried to bring it out in their work.
Это попытка продолжить хорошие, добрые начинания в конце XIX, в начале XX века так называемой московской школы композиторской.
Gleb Pechonkin remembers the good work done in the late 19th and early 20th century by members of the so-called Moscow School of Composers. Trying to rid the Russian music of the excessive impact of the foreign styles, they searched for everything that was genuinely Russian in our music. Alexander Kostalsky, Pavel Chesnokov, and the world-famous composer and pianist Sergei Rachmaninov all went their own way, but they all agreed on the main thing, the pursuit of the genuinely Russian roots in our church music. The Pesnoslov Choir performed a Christmas chant written by Alexander Kostalsky. Even though this piece may not signal the return of the strictly monophonic Old Russian singing style, some of its elements are certainly present here. Composer Pavel Chesnokov, an undisputed authority in choir music, who led a number of church choirs in the first half of the century, had a very unorthodox way of working with the old music. He created harmonies, or chords, to accompany the old chants, and for that he was criticized by the more conservative members of the Russian church music establishment, who argued that transformations only harmed the richly textured old tunes. The more liberally minded musicians, however, countered that. There was nothing bad in trying, because life is changing, and art and our perception should be changed too. Exacting as he is, Gleb Pechonkin still deems it possible to perform Pavel Chesnokov's adaptation of this old chant. back to the old singing manner Gleb is talking about, it has almost intactably been preserved in the Russian monasteries, where talented and highly professional precentors have organized a number of absolutely wonderful choirs, each with its own local traditions-inspired flavor. In the famed Kiev Pechora Monastery in Ukraine, the old chants were originally performed in several voices. With this polyphonism rooted deep in the past, the purists regarded this Ukrainian singing manner as something original and viable. The Praise the Lord from Heaven chant, performed by Pesnoslov Choir, who sings the liturgical chants, even the most solemn ones, with such amazingly free-flowing abandon. Explaining this unorthodox singing manner, Gleb Pechonkin says that the notational symbols used in Old Russian church music had nothing to do with what we have today.
Дело в том, что крюки и вся вот эта система записи церковных песнопений была сформирована совершенно не случайно. И это есть не совсем те самые музыкальные знаки, к которым мы привыкли.
And denoted not just one note, but a whole musical phrase and the direction of that phrase. They paid a great deal of attention to nuance, something the modern notational symbols can never do. That's why the present-day adaptations of these old chants look more like a scheme, dry and lusterless, as if bereaved of life. Look, those old Russian singers memorized countless musical phrases which then were used like bricks to build a single whole. The more experienced the singer was, the more such phrases he knew. These musical symbols showed him the broad outlines of the song he was going to sing, and his memory and talent helped create variations of that tune. Hence, all that freedom and inspiration, Gleb says. And the next moment he offers to sing from old sheet music, and who am I to disagree?
Радуйся, обрадованная, Богородице Дево, из Тебе возвсия, солнце праведное, Христос Бог наш, просвещай и живот веселися и ты, старче праведный, прием его объятия, свободителя душам нашим.
The first thing that comes to one's mind after such singing is how many people can sing this way now? How many such phrases he remembers? And is it really possible to know all, or almost all of them?
Конечно, я не могу сказать, что я знаю все, да это и невозможно, но на уровне практическом, чтобы это можно было...
Of course, I cannot say I know them all. It's an impossible task, Gleb says. But I still know enough to sing in church and teach others. I wish to God this ability always stays with me. There are more and more people willing to master this technique. The musicians are holding conferences to discuss the methods of deciphering and performing the old music. In a word, things are always a-changing in our church music these days, and the old traditions are coming back, Gleb Pechonkin continues. I would be a happy man, he adds, if I could pick up where the composers of the Moscow school once left off, that quest for our roots. Many people realize this need, including such luminaries as the great 20th century composer Igor Stravinsky, who also tried his hand in writing liturgical chants. His larger-than-life talent brushed off also on his religious compositions, which sounded a bit strange when performed in church. But it's essentially Russian music, and that's why we sing it along with the genuine old chants and contemporary religious compositions.
Нашего ради спасения шедшего с небес, и воплотившегося Духа Святаи, Марии Девы и вочеловечася, распятого же за мы при Понтисте Пилате, и страдавша и погребена, и воскресшего в третий день по Писаниям, и вошедшего на небеса, и сидящего одесную Отца, и паки грядущего со славою, судите живым и мертвым, Его же царствию не будет конца. И в Духа Святого Господа животворящего, и же от Отца исходящего, и же с Отцем и Сыном споклоняемо и славимо, глаголавшего пророки, воединую святую соборную и апостольскую церковь, исповедую едино крещение во оставление грехов, чаю воскресения мертвых и жизни будущего века. Аминь.
The Pesnoslov Male Choir, whose members perform old Russian church music and contemporary stylizations, was introduced by Nadezhda Pronina. This program was prepared by Vladimir Dyomin, edited by Tatiana Shvetsova, and presented by me, Boris Novikov. Tune in at the same time next week for another edition of The Christian Message from Moscow.
Господи,